All right, so once again, this is Chris Thiede with Comarch Magazine, and I'm here with Michael Grove. I think, Michael, before we get started, why don't you just introduce yourself, tell us who you're with, what your position is, what you do, and just kind of give us that overall kind of introduction.
Of course. So thanks for having me, Chris. I'm Michael Grove. I'm the chair of landscape architecture, civil engineering, and ecology at Sasaki. We are a Boston, Denver, and Shanghai-based interdisciplinary design firm. We work globally, solving projects related to climate change and resiliency, adaptation and mitigation, anything involving cities and urban design, access to open space, and the public realm.
Okay, great. So we're here to talk today a little bit about the idea of urban living and how it's kind of perhaps, maybe lost its luster over the last 6 months or so for a variety of reasons. I guess talk a little bit about the kind of current shift away from urban living and what might be driving it.
Well, I think the shift away from urban living is actually somewhat of a fallacy. There was a bit of a knee-jerk reaction in the beginning of the pandemic where people felt that living in cities was somewhat dangerous. You were more prone to acquiring the disease by being in this kind of dense urban environment. Parts of that are true. When you're living in dense conditions with other people indoors, poorly ventilated spaces, yes, that's kind of where the virus is transmitted. It doesn't correlate to cities, though. It correlates to kind of density of people within a dwelling unit, not necessarily within an urban area. So I think there has been somewhat of a migration out to the suburbs, but the real estate data just doesn't back that up, with few exceptions. When you look at the high price markets of New York and San Francisco, some of those urban properties are staying on the market a little bit longer, but in most cities around the country, urban real estate prices have stayed consistent. They're still selling. I think people are more nimble right now as we're in this work from home situation. So you have people flexible with where they are. Maybe they're moving to be closer to families, but they're still looking at cities. Cities are actually thriving. It's maybe just not the usual suspects.
Okay. So, so I guess talk a little bit about then, why you think this should kind of continue in terms of not the shift away from it, but the kind of shift into it, perhaps into cities, and why you think that's an important thing to support.
Well, cities are where about 80% of the world's population lives right now, and it's only on about 10% of the entire Earth's land mass. So cities are incredibly efficient in terms of how we use the land. They're also wonderful drivers of innovation and economic prosperity. So cities, when we're around each other, we're sharing ideas, we're inventing new things, we're building new economies. When we spread each other out, there's a bit less connection in order to kind of drive those economic forces that we all need. The other shift away from cities, which concerns me, is our encroachment onto remnant forests. And this is something that's not new. Suburbanization and suburban sprawl is something that's been of concern to environmentalists and landscape architects like me for decades. When we destroy the remnant forests, where we have this incredible biodiversity, that's when we're making ourselves prone to attracting these zoonotic diseases to humans. The World Health Organization estimates that about 75% of all emergent diseases are zoonotic, meaning they're crossing over from animal species to human species. So when we increase that amount of interface between people and native species and the habitats that they belong in, but we don't, that's when we have more vulnerability to acquiring some of these diseases like COVID-19 or SARS or MERS or swine flu, you name it. They're all kind of these emergent diseases because we are in habitats that humans really don't belong in.
Okay. So then kind of going back to cities, how do cities need to change perhaps or adapt to, to meet the kind of the lifestyle demands or, the way people want to live, moving forward in the future, whether, we're talking about, avoiding diseases and whatnot, or even just quality of life and that sort of thing.
Sure. I think urban designers and landscape architects have been shifting that narrative of the city of being this kind of concrete jungle, lifeless space into something that's much more rich, that has more biodiversity, that has more equitable access to open space, that's a more connected open space system that allows for improved pedestrian mobility around cities. This is what's driving the value proposition in cities. When you have these wonderful waterfronts, urban parks, and that habitat richness within them, it's making cities much more livable, both for humans and for the wildlife that can continue to thrive in cities. We don't need to push wildlife out to the fringes. We can allow some of that wildlife to, whether it's birds or small mammals or insect species, to live in. This is for them. I think the other thing we need to think about quite a bit is our policy around affordable housing. One of the issues, as I mentioned before, is the amount of density within dwelling units. And when you don't have affordable housing stock within these larger cities like a New York or San Francisco that's unaffordable and unattainable for so many, that's where you have some of those kind of urban slum conditions of too many people living in spaces without access to beautiful natural open spaces. So there's historically been kind of a marginalized group, an underrepresented group, and essentially environmental racism within our cities that's prevented people from having the same access to all of the amenities that modern cities offer if they don't have the means or any other kind of economic resources to afford that. So it's really on us as designers to influence policymakers and politicians to change the way that they're thinking around cities, change historic practices like redlining, to make it a much more equitable future for everyone.
Okay. So, and you mentioned the idea of biodiversity and green space and things like that, and that kind of brings up the idea of farming as well. And so, talk a little bit about, you had some ideas in terms of a shift in farming, maybe not away from traditional farmlands, but certainly incorporating it more into urban landscapes. Talk a little bit about that.
Absolutely. I'm a huge proponent of urban farming. When we look at our land use as it relates to agriculture in the world, it's really quite significant. About 80% of tropical forests are lost to farming practices. That's an incredible amount of species diversity that we're losing every year just because we're farming in kind of an incorrect way. When you think about it, we haven't really changed the way that we've been farming for 10,000 years. We're still kind of moving forward, looking for fresh, fertile soil, tearing down forests in order to kind of feed our need for more agriculture. Unfortunately, a lot of that is commodity agriculture, the grains that are going into feeding livestock and things like that. So one part of it is shifting how we eat and what we eat, but also how we're actually practicing farming. So essentially, when you're disturbing soil or cutting down rainforests, you're releasing carbon back into the atmosphere. There's no need to practice traditional soil-based farming with all these modern advances that we've made in urban farming. And it doesn't have to be this sci-fi kind of futuristic idea. It's already happening. There could be rooftop farms, which are soil-based. That's also helping our buildings become more energy efficient. It's capturing stormwater that's falling into our cities. It's increasing biodiversity in our cities. It could be greenhouses, both within the city and on the fringes of the city, that are allowing for local produce to be closer to us and be fresher for us. Or it could be vertical farms that are grown in hydroponic environments that are stacked, that are very efficient, grown under LED lights. These can be grown in underground parking structures, old warehouses, other kind of underutilized spaces in our urban environment.
Okay. And so, and did you have some specific ideas? I think that, in previous information that I'd seen from you, there were some kind of concepts or ideas that you and your firm had developed.
Yeah, so we're working on a number of exciting projects around the world that involve urban agriculture. One of my favorites is the Sunqiao Urban Agriculture District in Shanghai. Shanghai is a city of 23 million people, so that's an incredible amount of mouths to feed, but it's really no different than most other cities around the world where their produce is coming from far-flung places. Here in the US, 90% of most of the food that we eat is coming from California or Florida. When it's not in season, we're shipping it from South America. So there's a huge carbon footprint just associated with that. But what we're doing in Shanghai, where about 56% of their diet is already leafy greens, think bok choy and spinach and lettuce, those are the perfect crops for these vertical hydroponic systems that I was mentioning. So what we're doing there is stacking vertical greenhouses in the middle of the city. Sunchao was one subway stop away from Shanghai Disneyland, so it's really quite centrally located. And then shipping all of those crops out to local grocery stores so that everyone in Shanghai is having access to this fresh produce. That's incredibly important from a nutritional content as well, because the food, once it's harvested on a traditional farm, loses about 30% of its nutritional content within 24 hours, and as much as 80% within about a week. And so when you think about when that food was picked and then shipped and then sits in your grocery store shelves before it gets to your plate, that's a huge amount of nutritional content loss. So if we can get fresher food to people faster, that's a benefit from a number of viewpoints, carbon emissions, and access to fresh food.
Okay, so this is more than just a concept then. These are actual projects that are being developed right now.
Absolutely. We're working with the Chinese Academy of Agriculture on the project. It's in design phases at the moment, but it's a really exciting opportunity where we're transitioning what's single-story greenhouses right now into something that's much more dense to really mirror the density of Shanghai and feed that population.
Okay. And so how do you see projects like this or ideas like this coming to the United States?
Well, it's already happening here in the United States as well. There's rooftop farms. The Brooklyn Grange in New York City is doing some wonderful things on rooftops throughout the New York metro area. In San Francisco Bay Area, there's Plenty, which is an urban agricultural startup. Outside of New York City in Newark, New Jersey, there's Arrow Farms, which is the largest vertical farm in the world. It's happening here in Boston, where I live, where we have Green City growers planting urban gardens on top of Fenway Park. So you have a historic structure beloved by many where, you know, when you're going to watch a baseball game, the salad that you're eating or the lettuce on your burger may have been grown, you know, just a few feet away from where you're sitting in the stands. So again, this is something that needs to happen at scale. These are small test ideas right now that I think are beginning to gain traction. But once we figure out how to make it more ubiquitous around the world, around the country, then I think it's just becoming a part of how we're going to practice agriculture in the future.
So how do we get there? I mean, what would it take for that this type of practice to become more ubiquitous?
It's going to take a number of new kind of inventive technologies to make it happen, and really just understanding the price of that technology. Right now, the biggest barriers are the cost of LED lighting, which is necessary for the indoor growing, cost of space in urban areas. I think that might begin to change as we move to more autonomous vehicles, and places like underground parking garages are going to become less utilized. So that's a great opportunity to use that kind of basement space for those farms. Cost of the energy required, if it's still bought from the grid versus kind of being off-grid solar. These are all things that factor into the equation of how to make it more cost effective.
So basically, the bottom line is that the cities and kind of farmland and so forth, we tend to think of those as being very, very separate, separate in a lot of ways, certainly by distance, but also just by how they're used and density, population density and so forth. But it seems like they can coexist quite naturally, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think in our minds, we have this urban-rural dichotomy where it's either one or the other. And that's kind of how we've lived our lives throughout most of the 20th century. It wasn't always like this. Kind of that's a relatively new thing, separation of cities from agriculture. If you think back to how most cities developed, you had a really high density urban core surrounded by productive farmland. Where farmers would bring their goods to market every day. We had this very intimate relationship with our food and the farmer who grew our food. Today, we have 5 multinational corporations controlling about 80% of the food that we eat. That needs to shift, and we need to redevelop a relationship with the farmers and the people who are growing the food that we eat. And I think urban agriculture is really the solution to that if we can get past the cost hurdles, and I think that's coming.
Great. Well, anything else before we kind of wrap up here? Anything else that you want to kind of conclude with?
The only thing I'd mention is that I think this is an opportunity for a lot of developers when they're thinking about additional, mixed uses in their districts to think about. It has incredible energy savings if you're thinking about putting it on the rooftop. There's wonderful community benefits for people to use these farms, and even if they're not actively farming, to have space that's really accommodating a productive landscape rather than just an aesthetic landscape. There's wonderful benefits for all of the residents and visitors to those communities and districts to take advantage of.
All right, well, this feels like a pretty good place to stop. Thank you very much for your time this morning.
Thanks, Chris. It was my pleasure.